What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Boys Do Sports. Today I've got my starts and sits, and then we'll go through a couple defenses. Quick PSA, another early game Sunday. Sounding like this is going to be a common occurrence, so make sure to get up early on Sunday, set your lineups. Let's get right into our starts. Quarterback, we got Jared Goff. He is finally going to be back home after being on the road in 4 of the last 6 games. In his first home game of the season, he scored 33 fantasy points against the Bears. He is much better at home, especially in a game likely to be a shootout. The Buccaneers, they love to have a shootout. The Buccaneers allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this season. Running back, Quinshon Judkins. Managers may be hesitant to start him after an atrocious outing last week against the stout Steelers defense. The Dolphins allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to running backs and have allowed 98 or more yards from scrimmage to every running back this season, including 234 yards to Rico Dowdle and 138 yards to Kamani Vidal over the last 2 weeks. At wide receiver, we got Courtland Sutton. The Broncos-Jets game in London last week was just a weird game. I don't think we need to take anything from that game other than the Jets are bad. Because before that, Sutton had 3 straight 17-plus fantasy point weeks. He's going to bounce back against this up-and-coming Giants team that allows the 3rd most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. At tight end, we got Harold Fannin Jr. Last week, I went with David Njoku. Bad start. Should have went Fannin, I guess, because he broke out. David Njoku is not expected to play this week, and Fannin has averaged 13.2 fantasy points per game with Dylan Gabriel at quarterback. The Dolphins allowed the 8th most fantasy points per game to tight ends, and Fannin should build off his breakout last week where he had 10 targets, 7 catches for 81 yards. Get into my sits. Quarterback Sam Darnold. He may look startable coming off of 2 good games in a row, but the Texans allow a league-low 10.2 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. If Derek Stingley can somewhat keep Jason at bay, Sam Darnold will be forced to throw elsewhere and could have a bad week. I know keeping Jason at bay is going to be impossible, but he's not been playing a lot of the slot. So Derek Stingley could shadow him the whole game and not give Darnold many looks. So I'm avoiding Sam Darnold this week, but if you got Jason, you got to start him. Running back Travis Etienne. His volume has come down over the last 2 weeks, and he's only playing about 60% of the snaps, so definitely not a workhorse. But he doesn't need to be a workhorse to be good, but his volume has gone down. And that's because the Jaguars' passing game has come alive, and they are not relying on the run like they were the first couple weeks. So the Rams have allowed the 2nd lowest fantasy points per game to running backs, and Etienne is just not going to be a good start this week. I think the last 2 weeks he has scored less than 10 fantasy points in each of them. Wide receiver Devonta Smith. The Vikings are an awful matchup for a struggling offense, which the Eagles are. They allow the lowest fantasy points per game to wide receivers by a large margin and have contained all slot wide receivers this season. I went back and looked. No slot wide receiver has had a good game against them. There are too many mouths to feed in this offense when they're all healthy. And Devonta Smith very rarely has good games with A.J. Brown and Dallas Goedert healthy. Tight end T.J. Hawkinson. The Eagles only allow 5.9 fantasy points per game to tight ends, which is the 4th lowest. Hawk has had less than 40 yards in 4 of 5 games this season and less than 50 all season. Honestly, Hawkinson is getting close to a drop candidate since Jordan Addison has been back since week 4. I don't really care who's at quarterback, if it's Wentz or if it's J.J. McCarthy. I just don't see Hawkinson getting going with Addison and McCarthy. Or Addison and Jefferson. Let's get into some defenses. Obvious starters are definitely going to be Seahawks versus the Texans, the Broncos versus the Giants, and the Patriots versus the Titans. Now you got to watch out for the Broncos versus Giants because last week the Eagles versus Giants was a good start, and that turned out to not be correct. Less owned teams to start. A bunch of them this week. Rams versus the Jaguars. Rams have a very good defense. Bears versus the Saints. Bears defense looking better. Saints are awful. Falcons versus 49ers. Falcons are kind of honestly looking like they might have one of the better defenses in the NFL. They score a lot of fantasy points, so that's what matters here. Chiefs versus the Raiders. Pretty obvious there. Panthers versus the Jets. The Jets are bad. No Garrett Wilson. And then the Jets versus the Panthers. The Jets have a decent defense. They just held the Broncos down. And then the Giants versus the Broncos. Giants, Jets just held the Broncos down. Giants have a pretty good offensive line. Chance for several sacks here. One highly owned defense to avoid. It's the Lions versus the Buccaneers. The Ravens are on bye this week, so we can't mention them. But the Lions versus the Bucs. The Lions secondary is just absolutely decimated. I am for sure out on Lions defense this week. The Bucs Baker Mayfield is throwing touchdowns to practice squad wide receivers every week and is still scoring 30 plus points a week. So probably MVP Baker's season, but we'll see. But not starting the Lions defense against them. No thanks. But yeah, guys, that's all for my starts and sits. Good luck this week with your fantasy matchup, and thanks for watching.